Yes, we are.
Just give it 2 minutes.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Cove Park's YouTube channel. Welcome to the very first event in our public program series connected to Future by Design. My name is Francesca Bertolotti Bailey, and I am the CEO of Cove Park, an artist residency and a research center in the west of Scotland. Future by Design is a collaboration between Cove Park and a series of people in Ghana and Scotland. It's a project initiated by and funded by British Council, Architecture, Design and Fashion in the lead up to COP26. The project brings together Ghanaian Filipino agro-waste designer and materials engineer Myling Loko, who is here tonight, and Scottish architect Tom Morton of ARC Architects, and two multidisciplinary cohorts of young people in Scotland and Ghana, young professionals, students from the Ashesi Entrepreneurship Center in Ghana, from the Mackintosh School of Architecture in Glasgow, from the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, etc., etc., etc. All of these people together will work in collaborative ways to design, co-design, think, and co-develop protostructures and prototypes that will address the impacts of climate change on water in Scotland and Ghana via proactive design. The main issue, both in Scotland and Ghana, in terms of the impacts of climate change on water, is flooding. And that is what we're talking about tonight. I will not really speak any longer, and I will make sure that Myling Loko instead will say a little bit more about the project. But I will only say thank you to British Council, to Parvinder Marwaha and Severa Davis, to Arts and Business Scotland, and to everyone involved in this very ambitious and very urgent project. Thank you and enjoy. Myling, to you.
Thanks, Francesca, and good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you all this evening. Over the past few weeks, it's been an exciting kickoff for both our teams here in Accra and in Helensburgh, where Cove Park is located. And in thinking about COP26, we've noticed that a lot of the discussion around flooding has been focused on coastal erosion. And this is obviously because of the huge impact of coastal erosion on, the shifts that are happening on our land and in our rainfall patterns. We know that, in West Africa, particularly here in Ghana, over 30 meters of land is eaten away every year. And our coastal population on this side of the continent, about a third of our GDP and our population is generated from these territories. But the approach we're taking in this project is looking at the problem of flooding and rainfall on land holistically. And we're also trying to think about the patterns happening not so far away from the coast, about 1 kilometer away or a kilometer away from the coast, and the activities in terms of building, in terms of architecture, in terms of landscaping that are actually exacerbating the problem. So we're questioning how we're building, where we're building, and what we're building over. So a huge part of this is not just the land and water, but the loss of an extreme amount of biodiversity and ground cover that for a very long time has been able to mitigate rainfall onto our territories. Tonight is very exciting because this is the first chance that we have to dialogue and understand the complex phenomenon of flooding. And over the COVID period, in spite of all that happened, there was also the opening of a global series of conversations, one of which was stemmed from the New Architecture Writers Group, of which both Nana Biama Afusu and Louis Innes are part of. They're alumni of last year's program. And it's wonderful to engage with both these young professionals and talking about these problems in an intimate way that allows us to find out what we have in common between people who reside on the West African coast in Ghana and in Helensburgh in Scotland. So I'd like to welcome Lois and Nana, and thank you for hosting our talk tonight.
Thanks, Mary. I'd like to say welcome to everyone and thank you for joining us this evening for the first panel discussion event in Cove Sparks Future by Design programme. This evening's event is titled Future by Design, Flooding Across the Atlantic, which hopes to unpack the impact of flooding and climate change from a really international perspective, but specifically in Scotland and Ghana, where some of our panel are calling in from. So that's really exciting. We'd first like to say a big thank you to Francesca, Alexia, Emma, and everyone else on the Cove Park team who have been immensely helpful in pulling this event together. And to May and Tom, of course, for inviting us to host this discussion tonight. I'll briefly introduce Nana and myself. We are both architectural designers based in London and writers who are alumni members of the New Architecture Writers Programme, which is a free London-based programme for emerging design critics. We will be hosting tonight's discussion with our amazing panel. We are joined by Dr. Zanata Ajiman Rawlings, hopefully Kweku Owusu-Tuume, who has not joined yet, but hopefully will, Rebecca Cross and Dr. Julia King. Yes, thank you on behalf of all of us for joining us tonight and welcome. I think you're free to introduce yourselves properly once we get started in a bit more detail than I can provide. But as an overview for our audience, we have Dr. Zanata, who is serving her second term as Honourable Member of Parliament of the Klotikole constituency in Ghana. Zanata is joining us, I think, all the way from Ghana's capital, Accra, along with Kweku, who is a geodata technologist and research consultant, also based in researching in Ghana. We have Rebecca Cross, who is currently studying at the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh. And finally, Dr. Julia King, who is a design practitioner and research fellow at LSE Cities. For more information about our panel, you can head over to Cove Park's website, where there's a news feature on this event, or to their Instagram, where there are full dedicated posts about them. Just a quick note on the structure of this event. We're hoping for maybe one and a bit hours of discussion, and then we'll leave 10 minutes at the end for any audience questions. You can submit these via the chat function. I can't see the page, but it's usually on the right-hand side of the stream, or join and continue the discussion on social media using the hashtags found on the Instagram page and tagging Cove Park so that we can see you. If you do want to make a comment on the YouTube channel, I think you'll need to sign in to your YouTube account, which is usually linked to your Google one. So hopefully that's very straightforward. And yeah, I'll hand over to Anna.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us this evening. And thank you firstly to Francesca, May, and also Lois for those introductions. And thank you very much to our guest panelists for joining us. We're really excited to be in conversation with you this evening. And hopefully get a conversation across ourselves and with you all, and also with our audience. So yeah, just to, as Lois mentioned, the conversation will last about an hour, and we intend for it to be quite a discursive format, and we hope to generate a conversation not just with ourselves as the host, but also with between yourselves as panelists. So the conversation this evening, as been alluded to, will broadly centre on the transatlantic context of flooding. We want to have a broad and open discussion, which while situated in terms of location, by the Future by Design project, which will be working in Ghana and Scotland, recognises the flooding and water mismanagement and the treatment of water are global issues and global threats, and therefore we must recognise the scale of those threats and think in a kind of more holistic and global scale, and also learn from different contexts about what we can do in other regions to support the work that's already being undertaken. So on that note, I'd like to just kind of jump straight in. And I guess my first question is for the whole panel, as just a way of kind of getting into the conversation about, you all come from very different angles in terms of your research to do with climate change or interest in climate change and flooding and water management. So I think it'll just be, I'd like to open up the floor with asking about how the question of flooding and water has been centered in your respective research and your approaches, and how you sort of summarize that within your work so far. So I'm going in no particular order, just by screen. We'll start with Rebecca, please. Thank you.
Hiya. Well, it's obviously very prevalent in terms of planting in a horticultural sense. And there's a lot more focus on it in urban areas in terms of urban sort of gardens being paved over to have more space for vehicles, essentially. But I believe people are having more of a switch now and know how important it is to just have more green spaces within urban areas, and how plants can really mitigate flooding, not just trees, but everything found on trees, including mosses and all sorts of bryophytes. And these can be used in green roofs as well. So there's all sorts of ways you can incorporate it into a infrastructure sense in terms of planting. So that's kind of my broadest scope on it in studying so far.
That's really interesting. I really enjoy how you described planting as infrastructure, because I think most of the time when those words come up, we definitely think of more man-made structures and compositions, rather than maybe with the kind of natural world as our given infrastructure to work with as well. So perhaps I can now hand over to Dr. Julia, and then we then move on to Dr. Zanator, please.
Please call me Julia. I've done a PhD, but I still think Dr. King doesn't feel quite right. So yeah, I mean, flooding for me it's tangential. I mean, I trained as an architect and found myself working in the world of sanitation and water in India, which is where I did my PhD. It's where I grew up, and I got very interested in sanitation, which is interlinked with waste and interlinked with water and interlinked with flooding. Because my sort of field of work and the sites that I look at are places of thinking about how to provide infrastructure, to provision infrastructure for the unprovisioned. And often where you find yourself in that context is in marginalized communities, often low-lying land, so it can flood, or over waste, so it's sort of toxic. And often, when a small amount of rainfall lands in many cities around the world, that will cause toilets to just literally overflow, and that will affect the poorest of the poor the most. And so there is this sort of huge sort of intermingling. And I guess I definitely have an urban tilt to my work. And more recently, I've been looking at Ethiopia and Pakistan and the lives of waste pickers, which, is hugely interlinked with all these conversations. And so I guess what I will probably bring to the conversation today is sort of thinking about how these problems are both technical and social, and the tools that I use, like mapping, and how mapping can be, how mapping is sort of central to understanding the problem and seeking out solutions, and how this requires sort of fine-grained, mapping in an expansive sense, and how this requires fine-grained understanding of what's happening on the ground. And also, I think there's a sort of an increasing emphasis of people who work in the sort of global south, to use that term, problematic term, that there is a sort of a resistance to networked ideals, let's say from London, of sanitation infrastructure and what that looks like. And I think the planting ties in directly to that. It's not about planting, it's about big pipes. And actually, we really need to look at contexts on their own terms. And this all links with sort of mapping. So yeah, it's not an explicit relationship, but yeah. And I think what I'm going to try and bring is these sort of connected urban dimensions.
I think it's really interesting what you say about context on their own terms, and the kind of, really understanding that kind of situated infrastructure that you find in the context in which you're working. And I think it's a really nice moment to perhaps bring you and Dr. Zanator talking about the very particular context of Accra and some of your work and interest in becoming a parliamentarian based on that context that you're working in.
Thank you so much. I think you've all mentioned various aspects of what contributes to the flooding, but in Accra, interestingly enough, to start with, we have to look at the topography of Accra, and Accra is actually low-lying and made up of seasonal streams and rivers. There are a lot of names that that have been given to various parts of Accra, which give reference to historically what was there before, whether it was like some kind of water body or something. And with climate change, what happened is there was a master plan for Accra, which went as far back as independence. And this was supposed to guide, you know, the building of various things, whether it was the green zones, whether it was, you know, real estate, whether it was office buildings or whatever it was all guided by what was known to be the presence of certain seasonal streams and rivers. Now, with time and with the change in climate, people stopped paying attention to that. Unfortunately, with what has become a problem across the continent, which I have to mention, with the issue of corruption, where people are able to pay certain, you know, certain officials to rezone areas. So it's an area that's supposed to be a green zone suddenly becomes rezoned into an area that's supposed to be for real estate. And if you had a green zone in what was originally a waterway, you had no problem because you have this huge space, you have lots of, you know, topsoil, you have the sand, there's extra water, it gets absorbed. You turn it into real estate. The real estate people are not always guided by the, you know, what we expect, the proper use of land, where there's supposed to be a park within a particular area, where the drains are supposed to be a particular size to deal with the capacity of the density of population and all of that. So then you have a situation where people are building in waterways, and then it rains heavily and suddenly it starts flooding, and then there are shouts the government should come to our aid and this and that. And yet, if you really go back historically, you'll find that there's a particular area where there were not supposed to be houses, but there are now. And what that's doing now as well is it's depriving those who actually abided by those regulations historically of the safety on where they were living, because now the water will find the path of least resistance. So if it can't go where it's meant to, it goes elsewhere. So now you have people who were in the originally properly planned areas who are now having their buildings flooded every time it rains. Then you have the disposal of solid waste into our waterways, which is another thing. We're not doing enough recycling. We're using lots of single-use plastics. And what that's doing as well is that it's decreasing the capacity of our, you know, our drains and waterways to carry the volume of water that's coming downstream from the mountains. And that's another cause of, you know, the flooding. And then there's obviously the other part where so many green zones have been rezoned into everything else but. So now we don't have that extra surface area that allows the water to drain. In some of the higher areas in the mountains, certain areas that were originally designated as reservoirs, so that when there was a heavy downpour, some of the water would remain there and it wouldn't all come downhill. Those have also been rezoned. People are building in those areas. So now all the little measures that were in place, whether intentionally or just naturally there, have sort of been cleared out of the way over the years. And all we're seeing is this annual recurrent flooding. And some of the drains that were built not with the original water bodies in mind, because I guess at that point, some people didn't realize there were certain seasonal rivers where they were building the drains. So when there's a heavy downpour, sometimes the water does not find itself going into the drains because it's following its natural path. And so then you have a drain that's not actually doing what it's meant to do properly, because water goes where water will go. And we don't have enough planting of trees. There's almost everyone building a house is putting concrete or tiles around the houses. So really, there's nowhere for the water to go, and it creates the flooding. Recently, we've had a lot of floods in the Ashanti region where Kumasi is, and houses that never used to get flooded have been broken and destroyed by the water because of exactly the same thing, where people are building structures in areas where they shouldn't. So we have a problem with enforcement, because we know where people shouldn't build, you know. So that's one of the issues that's crippling our attempts at just trying to keep people safe and ensure that water is having some access to flow, because otherwise it just becomes this perennial problem where people's livelihoods are constantly being destroyed. People are losing their lives and their homes because this keeps happening. And now we can't even predict where it's going to happen because of what people are doing with, building of structures around. When my mother was younger, she said there were never walls. People had hedges. Now everyone has a wall. And the point is, now you have security concerns, which are more serious now than then. So you can't insist that people shouldn't have walls. But what that is doing as well is it's creating another dam to the flow of water. So it's a multifactorial issue going on here. And the population density of Accra has just gone totally out of control. And it doesn't match the capacity of the drains that we have as well. Then we have the issue of some of the public toilets, which have been built exactly as you described, where it gets flooded and then, fecal matter is actually just emptied into the waterways. It's a bit of a nightmare. And we have lots of ministries that are meant to deal with this. And perhaps that's another weakness. There's not enough collaboration between the various ministries, departments, and agencies. However, on a smaller scale, in terms of what can one do in a particular area, I think, May, you may have seen the children's park, which is also called the Ifwa Sutherland Park. It's opposite the Kempinski Hotel. I have been fighting to get my hands on that piece of land and the permission to actually do something, because every city that knows what it's about in Europe has a green space. And it's not because people don't have better things to do, and better in quotes, but with the level of pollution that you have, you need a green area, you need the trees, you need the plants, you need that source of extra oxygen and so on, and not enough is being done there either. So it's a bit of a tug of war trying to get people aligned with regards to how we can actually mitigate the effects of the rains and floods. So that's what I would say for now. And then I suppose later on in the conversation, I could bring some of the suggestions and solutions that we've actually started to work on.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator. You've spoken about the tragic floods which happened in June 2015, which led to a fire killing over 100 people in Accra. As one of your motivations for entering Parliament. Such a decision makes it clear of the impact of strategic and infrastructural planning in tackling the issue of flooding. But it's also important to bear in mind the human consequence of climate change and water mismanagement. And I wonder if you could firstly speak a little bit about the consequences of that tragedy for your constituents, as well as the Greater Accra region.
Yes, thanks. That was actually, in many ways, an avoidable situation. It could have been avoided by dealing with some of the issues I mentioned initially. There was a huge loss of life. 200 is the official number, thereabouts, but I think there were a lot more people who died, and we just haven't been able to account for them. It actually affected my constituency and lots of other constituencies surrounding mine. And because a lot of people commute and work in my constituency and don't necessarily come from. So the ripple effect did not just happen here. It was really across the entire city, if not the region. And what happened actually with that rain that day, as the flooding was happening, there was a service station, and water is heavier than fuel. So the water entered the reservoir, the fuel was being displaced, and someone lit a match or something. Well, there was a fire anyway, and it just spread and it just killed so many people, and they didn't see it coming. And a lot of people were actually taking refuge in the service station when the explosion happened, so there again, the issue of maintenance and became quite it came under the spotlight, and subsequently 2 other, fuel service stations had some kind of problem. But anyway, back to what it did. It was really tragic, and those who suffered burns, had severe disabilities from that. And our society is not quite not well enough established with regards to the care of persons with disability. So for those who ended up surviving and having serious burns, just struggled. And I've met a couple of them ever since, a couple of them who actually live in my constituency. One of them was going to school and she had to stop because one of her parents, who was the breadwinner, had died. So my office actually supported her with an academic sponsorship to help her continue. But this is a little drop in the ocean. In entering Parliament, what I did was I joined the Committee on Environment, Science and Technology and Innovation. That's the ministry, but it's the Science and Technology and Environment Committee, which I was a very active member of, because most of the agencies and departments which are responsible or play a very key role in how we need to manage things to either mitigate or prevent the flooding fall under that ministry. So of course, science, technology, innovation, environment, that deals with the land use and spatial, use. It also deals with the Environmental Protection Agency. We have the CSIR, which is the Commission for Scientific and Industrial Research, which they do a lot of research into different types of technology, whether it's relating to water purification or treatment of waste. Then we also have the local government aspect of things, where at the assembly level, at the district level, you have the environment, the EPA and all of these, the Environmental Protection Agency, amongst others, where they're supposed to deal with this. And for me, in coming into Parliament, the ability to have that oversight on a committee that could question what was going on the ground was important. There is a bit of inertia in the system, and one has to keep pushing and pushing, to keep the attention on some of these issues, because the nature of the flooding, it's seasonal. So when it stops, people's minds are averted and they end up thinking about other things. So it's just the ability to be consistently on the issue and keep pushing and pushing and pushing. For example, in my constituency now, the ministry that's responsible for ensuring that the huge drain is dredged so that it increases its capacity in terms of water is the Works and Housing Ministry. So one is having to deal with different ministries, and it can be a bit of a nightmare, because the minister, I invited him to come over to inspect the drain in my constituency. And when the media was asking a particular question, his response was, well, that's for the sanitation ministry, or that was for a different ministry, and it wasn't part of his mandate. And the problem with that is it creates a bit of a gray area where everybody kind of cops out on the ultimate responsibility of when the flood does happen, and that is a bit frustrating, but some of us just keep going because it's a long process. As we speak now, there's a loan that has been given for the re-engineering of the drainage system in Accra. My question that I keep asking at this point now is, are we making sure that we're not picking up a technology or a design that has not thought about the water that's coming from other places, because the idea of having, covered drains is great, provided you don't have so much waste coming into it that it blocks it up and then it just becomes a white elephant. So there are a lot of things. So I'm actually waiting to see what kind of design is going to be presented. And it would be really great to have your input on that, because Parliament does make room for, civil society organizations and other groups to actually come in to make their opinions known on certain issues and decisions that are going to be taken. So I think it would be a great opportunity to have that input based on the skill set that you all have. There's no point spending over $200 million on a re-engineering project that hasn't thought laterally about the problem, and then it just becomes a waste of money. So I'm excited about this panel because you're not only talking about things, you're doing it, you're looking for, organic ways of solving the problems. And I'm looking forward to the pilot project that you're going to do in my constituency. So, and it's something that one can use as a guide for what can be done easily without going for huge loans and waiting for 2 years for things to start.
I think, thank you so much for that. I think you've really touched on the kind of broader issues at play and the different parties that also contribute to this. And sometimes we forget to look at these things as on the lateral scale, the wider scale, and all the parties that contribute to them. And so without getting that, we fail to understand the kind of scope of the problem. And perhaps I can come to you, Julia, because you've worked in similar kind of contexts as perhaps in Accra in Ghana. And I'm just trying to understand what are some of the sort of maybe more local solutions that you found through your research and also working with local people, because I think one of the things that really came across from Dr. Zantor speaking there was that there's a kind of infrastructural question, but then there's also a kind of local person on the ground question, and how we start to maybe merge those two so that those two levels can begin to communicate with each other better. Seems like something to be really unpacked. So I wonder if we can perhaps elaborate a bit on that in your research and the areas you've worked in.
Yeah, firstly, Dr. Zantor, that was amazing. It's so interesting hearing you talking about Accra, sort of furiously writing notes. And I think, yeah, if I can sort of take your question, Nana, and begin with, so when, I mean, in a way, it was sort of a response to exactly the kind of project you're looking for. It was in India. We delivered a small decentralized sanitation project. It was really cheap, $20,000. And we worked with local communities, and you can do it. I mean, that's one of the sort of I mean, it's not all a positive story, and I don't have time to go into that, but you can do these things. One of the problems is that they're very time consuming. And this project was done sort of outside of the urban gaze. And I think you really articulated the problem of development, corruption, aggressive planning, which is global. And when what I started, I mean, pre-pandemic, some of the last projects that I was trying to get off the ground, all of a sudden these places were getting demolished, and that sort of rapid urban, like hyper accelerated urban change makes the kind of co-design someone said in the beginning in the intros, makes that really difficult. Because to take people along with you, it just requires time and a commitment to a place. And that is just time consuming. And that's one of the real problems. And I think, directly responding to what you were talking about, I could see this real tension between governments like large scale projects, because you can get big money from the UN or whatever. But actually those don't tend to deliver the nuance that we need in the kind of very complex environments that you articulated so well. And so, that's almost the problem, is that in those localized projects that we know can do the right thing and be sustainable and think expansively about infrastructure, like using planting rather than big oversized drains, that potentially gets into those gray zones that actually are unhelpful. So it's a very challenging problem. And, and I think I love that you use the word maintenance and care, because we really do need to shift our way of thinking about the built environment and the sector and architecture and design as really focusing on maintenance, because once you have that lens, the solution isn't going to be a big drain. If I can use London as an example, so we have one of the best, oldest pieces of infrastructure. I think it's set the tone for sanitation globally, and it's effectively a drain that runs along the side of London. It delivered all this housing, public infrastructure, fantastic. But today we're having to spend so much money on an overflow drain. Most cities in the world just simply do not have that kind of money. They just cannot do it. And London, in the plan, years ago when they were thinking about what to do, they did think about sort of sustainable drainage, getting rid of all the concrete, encouraging gardens, and so on. But it obviously for the big scale project. But I think there is something in that and that's what I meant by not taking Western ideas to other places, because there just isn't the money there. But so yeah, I mean, really fascinating. And then just finally, I mean, one of the thoughts I was thinking about when you were talking is that even the UN development goals, in this sense, for me, aren't very helpful. So separating housing, sanitation, and water. It's, when tends to be putting a toilet in is one of the single biggest drivers for investing in a house. So maybe even these goals in their sort of silos just exacerbate the problem and try to, so I'm just wondering from a political perspective, how can you actually engage with the complexity proactively? I don't know. I mean, I've not answered anything, but just some reactions there.
I wonder if this is a nice moment to bring in Rebecca. Julie talked about kind of the ineffectiveness of aggressive planning and kind of, short-term goals that are delivered over precarious four-year political terms. And I wonder if this is also a question about cities and population densities in cities. And I'd just like to come to Rebecca. You made such a wonderful observation in your biography about how nature has really informed you as a person and has been your classroom. You grew up homeschooled in the luscious landscapes of Devon. And speaking for myself and an increasing number of others who are now gravitating towards cities, there is a tendency to either constrain the natural world so that it conveniences us more, or we visit it as an attraction. And in both scenarios, I think we do a lot of harm. I wonder if you think we should be returning to a more symbiotic relationship with nature, and whether there are any opportunities or dangers associated with this way of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always kind of obvious to me to just be outside because that's what I love doing. It's what I've always done. But it's interesting and almost shocking sometimes how disconnected people are from just the environment that's even on their doorstep. And I know that's quite a deep-rooted sort of social issue. And it's hard to tackle it on like a large scale, but even when I talk to people, whether it's like work colleagues, friends of friends, and just making them aware of simple things and just appreciating what's there more. I know it's sort of sometimes hard, so getting funding for certain conservation projects and things like that from a plant point of view. Plants aren't always very cute or fluffy, like, save the puffin or save the moss. I think I'd probably go for the puffin. There was a cute picture. But it's sort of a key thing that we need to recognise how nature is so beneficial, not just the food it gives us, the materials, the medicines. The mental health aspect is incredibly important, which is something that has come out of COVID, I feel, which is one positive, really. I think society can really just lose very quickly what we don't appreciate, and that's quite linked to green spaces. What we don't see or use is suddenly being developed for housing. And by the time we realise that, it's too late. So I think we need to really appreciate what we have before it's gone. Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful way to tie in, I think, all three of your comments. And it strikes me as it's a question about kind of learning and taking people along the journey with you. Julia, you spoke a bit about co-design projects, and Dr. Zanato, you talked about urban green infrastructure and the lack of appreciation for those. And I think, Rebecca, you're so right. That kind of danger of not even not being aware of it, just taking it so for granted and not being immersed in it means that it's so easy for somebody to come along and go, you're not using that, let's have it for some housing. And that happens, especially in the Ghanaian context, happens so rapidly that it's kind of in a blink of an eye, and it's that's it. And I wonder if and I think that projects like these that Mei Ling and Tom and Future by Design are doing really are about also bringing people along on a kind of learning journey. And it strikes me as maybe part of this in Scotland, in Accra, and also in the places that you've worked, Julia, is really about that kind of co-design strategies or learning together, so that there is a more kind of deeply rooted cultural understanding of plants, biodiversity, and all these things, so that they're not just seen as is something over there, which is what, being in Ghana, you certainly get the sense of that. When Dr. Zanato, you talked about your mother saying everyone had hedges and now everyone has walls. We lose those things very, very quickly. And I wonder if perhaps I can come back to you, Julia, with some of the work you've done, how you've started to develop some of those co-design strategies, and maybe we can have a conversation about how we might start to take some of those into the work the Future by Design are doing, and into strategies for combating kind of flooding in Accra a bit better. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's where sort of the mapping is always my starting point, to sort of see how people are dealing with their own problems. Because one of the things that I think about a lot is that in an unprovisioned context, sort of people who've delivered the most housing in the world are they themselves, right? So in that context, when the state and the private sector has failed, which is sort of largely another global condition, I think there's something really valuable to learn from, let's say, how a house that doesn't have a drain will build themselves a little cesspit so that water can percolate, and go, okay, well, that's an individual practice. How can I, through small scale design interventions, make that more efficient? And in a way, it's that balance of going, it's not giving your hands up as a professional. It's sort of saying, look, I can help, but my first exercise is to look and learn and unlearn, and then you kind of come in and provoke sort of alternatives. And for me, a big thing is just that simple word of sharing. I tend to believe that if we seek consensus around decisions, that can be cheaper and better. And so initially, I think it's a real resistance to the individualism, which I think globally is our biggest problem. And the iPhone is the source of that, we can solve your problems through technology as an individual. I really don't think that that's a good avenue. And what I've found is that when you sit and show people that you've looked at their house, that you've looked at their neighborhood, that you've listened to their stories, and you've actually spent the time doing that then you can be propositional and think about what new thing needs to come in. I think that answers your question. I just want to say something that's really striking me about listening to both of you in really different contexts is, water is such an amazing resource. It's the thing of life, but yet it's such a problem when we mismanage it, when we mix it with effluent, when we don't let it flow naturally, and when we let it stagnate. So, in India and Venezuela, any kind of equatorial country, water stagnating is mosquitoes, but actually the solution is planting. But to get that imaginary is quite tough when I think many cities, many places are given this trajectory of like kind of glass buildings, and that's the thing, that's the end game. And I think we need to do a lot of work, because then going back directly to your question about, I have tried in the communities that, let's think about, mud walls or different architect, and people don't want them. And I think you also need to recognize that, there's a real move in architecture of like, let's take sort of like these sort of alternative methods of design. And actually, people want proper, solid houses. And so I think that's another balance that you've got to get right. And I think, so I don't want to dismiss anything, but it's always a balance. And I think listening is sort of central to that. Did I answer the question, Nana?
Yeah, you did really clearly. And I think also what's really interesting is what you've said about kind of balancing this need to want to aspire to what we think is a kind of global vision of success versus the local and the standard man. And it is a kind of careful balance. And I think it's really about that kind of exercise of listening to people's concerns, and also then really talking to one another in a way that it's not to say that, not to understand people's desires for the kind of globalized vision of improvement and success, but also actually what can we learn from our own local.
And so, sorry, if I can just quickly add something that responds to what Dr. Zanata was talking about with drains and covering them over. So we know this is bad practice, yet somehow there's so few projects that cities like Accra can look at alternatives. So there's like one in China, which gets a lot of attention, one in somewhere else, but there's like 3 globally good precedents. And I think that's a classic example of, it's a bad idea. Everyone in the sector knows it's a bad idea, yet it keeps on happening and it causes flooding. And it tends to then flood the poorest of the poor. It's not the rich people that get it, it's the poorest. And you throw the can down the drain, literally. And there's a, I mean, in Delhi, there was it did hit home when there was a big push, cover the drains. And then they created these toxic smells. and there was explosions. And so it's really a bad idea. But I still worry then, you know, and Dr. Zander, like, why are we still stuck doing this stuff? I find it kind of mind-boggling and quite depressing.
If I could just make a comment on that, if that's okay. I absolutely agree with you. The most frustrating thing is when you have the technocrats, okay? So you have a bunch of engineers who are telling you that this is the way to go. And you're a layperson and you know it's not the way to go. But who are they going to listen to? The engineer. And it's actually really frustrating. And perhaps maybe we need to look at the education again. Because, you know, if you're an engineer and you clearly can't see the connection between the covered drain and the flooding we're having, the people who suffer the flooding, they know the problem. And I wish I could, I don't know, it would be great. Maybe I could get some of the people who live in that area who are just your average people, really hardworking, normal people who can tell you exactly what the problem is and how to solve it. And they're not engineers.
Can I quickly jump in there? Sorry, I know I'm not following protocol, but Dr. Zander, you're totally right. So in architecture, so this is about maintenance and care, right? In architecture schools, the education of maintenance is entirely through the lens of heritage, how to maintain old buildings. We don't get taught how to maintain infrastructure or any of this stuff. So actually there is a huge gap. And I think the same, I don't know engineering because it's not my field and I don't teach in engineering, but I'm pretty sure we need to have curriculum changes in the built environment sector around maintenance and care and take it very seriously across the world.
No, thank you. No, this is exactly what we wanted. There's a really lively and very great debate and kind of panel, because I think we're just all kind of learning so much from one another and the kind of discussion, and actually also recognizes the similarities. And I really liked what you said about you know, the lack of examples exacerbates the problems, because if you can't see how it's been made, somebody else has done it, we then default to the kind of technocratic answer. It's the sure thing, it's one that's working. It doesn't matter so much what it does in 50 years, but right now it works. And as Rebecca was saying, you know, it's a lot easier to get money for big scale projects than plants. And that feels like a real battle in changing the way that we perceive value as well in these things, and thinking much more kind of long term about the ways that we set up infrastructure and mapping, and also perhaps then also re-looking at how we use technology to that end.
I agree. I just want to come in here and make an observation about the influx of data, particularly in Africa and particularly West African contexts. I can see that we've got Kweku who's joined the chat. Let us know if you're here. But I have a question for you specifically about data and your research as a geotechnologist. Say hi if you're there.
I think you might be muted.
I think you're muted, Kweku. Are you able to unmute yourself, Kweku?
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Hi. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. So sorry. I'm trying to get back with my video, but it looks like I'm having a little challenges, but I'm still working on it, and I should be fine.
That's okay. Your voice is perfect enough. I'd just like to ask you a question related to your research in data. And you mentioned that part of your research aims to close the data gap and also the environmental disconnect that exists between Africa, the global south, and other more developed economies. Data is arguably a very political thing at the moment, and it's kind of arguably a currency in its own right. And its influx to Ghana and other African countries is influencing both contemporary life and solutions to climate change issues. But there are still lots of tensions and disparities in access to data and actually its impact and use or misuse on African populations. I wonder if this is something that you've observed in your research or have been like actively seeking to address. Yeah, how might access to data promote a more resilient and autonomous local coping strategies to flooding?
Yeah.
The question to
you. Thank you, Lois. I believe one thing from the Global South that I have come to understand and as well as appreciate has got to do with the mechanism that interplays when it comes to the level of trust that the people or the local people have in the government. Sorry, Dr. Zaneto, but I'll have to play a bit political here. But then, what I just want to bring out is, unfortunately, the local people's
I think we may have lost you there, Kwaku. Well, perhaps
I'll agree with him though.
Until perhaps we get Kwaku back, perhaps I can draw you into the conversation, Rebecca, asking about the kind of local sort of flooding challenges in Scotland primarily, and the kind of ways in which planting has been used to successfully mitigate some of those. And are there any examples that we can draw into the conversation?
I can't think of any specific examples. Just I have sort of researched a bit with studying that Scotland has quite a hefty amount of agricultural land. I think we're about 70% agriculture, and it's always quite. It can be quite damaging when the land is poorly managed, and soil erosion can be a big part of that. When the soil is overworked, it becomes compacted, and this means, say, when you do get extreme flooding or any extreme rainfall, even that the soil can't do its job that it was intended for because it's been poorly managed, and the surface runoff is just it's very, very bad and goes into neighbouring habitats or neighbouring urban areas really. So it's a big part of making agriculture a bit more ecologically focused, and that's again a larger scale thing, but I think it definitely needs to be addressed more, even just in courses that are taught. I think there needs to be a bigger focus on the environmental implications of how we do things. Even horticulture has its negative effects on the environment, and it's important to be aware of these and not just forget about them, or always sometimes making students aware of just the great things about what you're studying. It's important to know about the darker side of it sometimes, and that we all have an impact on it, especially say the new generation going into it for the future. I think we need to be even more aware of the problems ahead of us and how to deal with them.
I think it's really interesting actually that we've slightly reframed the conversation a bit to also look at the rural aspect of it, because I think also sometimes certainly when I think of the rural condition, I certainly don't always imagine that they're problems. You assume that it takes care of itself, and the question of flooding and water management has always been drawn to the urban areas, because that's the bits where we feel that we control it and we want to contain the way it moves around and things like that. But it also does strike me as, if we don't understand in the natural realm or in the agricultural realm, we're just shifting the problem further downstream, as it were. And I think in the context of Accra and low-lying lands, we really do see that. And I guess my sort of follow-up question is, how historically perhaps some of these strategies have been developed in the rural landscape, that we might start to maybe rethink, and also maybe then use towards new ways of managing water and flood risks.
Yeah, I think it comes down to being more aware of what the land can give you. And it's easy just to keep taking and seeing it as a constant resource. But there are so many other ways of using the land without just, making it completely infertile afterwards. I mean, even something as simple as just having hedging, for example, in an agricultural field. I know it's not a one size fits all, but again, that can just slightly mitigate when you have severe flooding. It can just take away some of the pressure. And yeah, I think the education is a huge part of it. And again, having a bit more financial help if agriculture does want to shift slightly in how it does things, because there is a huge economic pressure on farmers globally as well, not just Scotland. So it does come down to a wider sense in how to help the problem.
Thanks, Rebecca. Dr. Zanish, I wonder if I could come to you next and change the focus slightly, bring the conversation back to the issue of management practices, and particularly want to shine some light on the social intervention work that you're doing in Osu to retrofit some of the market stalls operating there. You've been developing local technology to reduce the carbon footprint in the area, which is also high on the climate change agenda. As a bit of context, for those of you who don't know Osu, it is a very active and bustling commercial and recreational district in central Accra. And its market is typical of Ghana's historic open air trading culture, and functions largely without formal infrastructure. So given that the area is so in flux with lots of overlapping interests and territories, how have you been applying technology, which kind of seemingly requires some level of coherence and sophisticated networking with this very informal and ad hoc context? I wonder if you could.
Actually, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I was actually contemplating sharing that screen with you when we started speaking, and I thought, well, we're talking about something else, so it's fine. With regards to the use of technology that is eco-friendly, from my background is medical, that I'm a medical doctor, and for me, if you have the best hospitals and have a healthy environment, you're wasting your time. And that's the basis on which I'm so passionate about the environment. Everything begins and ends with the environment. And if we continue to delude ourselves about development and technology, and we think that leaving the environment behind is convenient, it's actually going to be our total undoing if we don't take care. So this was actually a project. Maybe I could share my screen because it's a bit easier to speak about it if I can share that with you. I don't know if I'll be able to share screen. Host disabled, participant screen sharing. Okay, so I can't share the screen, unfortunately. I think it's not an option for the call, but it would have been really interesting to show you because what we did.
Now.
Sorry?
You can share now.
Oh, can I? Oh,
Yeah,
great.
try
Yeah.
again.
Okay, here we go. What am I sharing now? Desktop. I think this one. PowerPoint. Okay, now I'm showing I'm a bit of an ignoramus. Technology, let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay, so anyway, while I'm trying, can you see my screen yet?
Not yet.
No.
No.
Okay.
Not yet.
Not yet. I don't know whether Gordon has a copy of that particular document. It was actually okay. Let me just give you a background of it. What happened was this market, which is the Osunite market, has literally everybody goes there to buy food, and it's usually the local food. Now, when I was campaigning to go into parliament, it was one of the things that women kept complaining about. And at the time, I wasn't really sure about the extent of the problem. They're complaining about the amount of smoke that they were having to work with. And I went there a couple of times, and I'm telling you, not only was there smoke, there was soot dropping down from the roof. So like they had these beams it's not a proper ceiling, so it's more like the beams. And as you're standing there, you get bits of soot actually falling on you. So it must be going in the food as well. And I was actually appalled because to have these women who are working so hard to make ends meet and are feeding people who are coming there all the time, living in such terrible conditions, I wasn't too pleased about it. And so we approached it using the triple helix concept, where it's supposed to be a combination of the like, let's say the research unit, which this was by a university, and then the stakeholders or the market, which was the market women, you know, so the industry, specifically food industry, and then myself representing government, because it's supposed to be a collaboration of the three to ensure success. And so what happened was there was a group that came from the University of Technology, coming from a University of Technology in Kumasi, and they came up with these smokeless ovens. And the idea was to retrofit the stoves that the women were using in order to ensure that they were not only having less exposure to smoke, but we were decreasing the carbon footprint. Because when people talk about carbon footprint, the only time you hear about it is when you're buying a plane ticket. Nobody really knows what that means. And it was to make it tangible and to make it, to let it have almost like a monetary value to it. Because when people are struggling to make ends meet and you're talking about an abstract concept, what do they care, really? You know, they're just trying to survive. But then the added value in terms of the monetary aspect of this was that in using these particular ovens, they were using less fuel, which means that they were making more profits, and they can actually use less wood. And now we have these briquettes that you make from the coconut, which they can use in these ovens. So it's not about just using charcoal all the time or wood, and they're using less of that. So there is a monetary value to protecting the environment. And that was the whole idea, to bring it home, you know, as opposed to this carbon footprint, what on earth is that? And sometimes you see a foot and you think, you know, it's about making it, oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, God bless you. So that's it over there. And what was great about this was we measured the carbon monoxide emissions before we installed the ovens and afterwards. And if you look over here, you can see there's a huge change. Gordon, can you zoom in to show how much of a change there was with regards to the carbon footprint? A huge change in the amount of carbon monoxide that was being released into the atmosphere, which says that you have value for the women, but it also says the environment is gaining. And the whole idea was to make a big concept, a big abstract concept, something so tangible. And the women are the ones who are selling it now. You know, I had a friend of mine who's actually a doctor, and she went to buy some kenkey at the market, and the women were going on and on about their ovens and how, you know, of course, it's great marketing for me as a member of parliament, but more importantly was the fact that now they're not working in a smoky environment. We've reduced the carbon footprint. They're spending less money on fuel to cook. They're exposed to less heat, and it's something that was locally developed, you know. So it kind of encompasses all those things that we're trying to do, that you can actually come up with technology that you can develop locally, that's technology sound, where you can actually quantify the improvement with regards to what you've achieved, and you can make it tangible to your average person. So it's not some abstract concept that only some scientists can understand. So that was really what that was about. And initially we did a stakeholder engagement with the women, and they weren't all interested, which was good, because it's always good to have that comparison. And so, you know, initially the gentleman from the university said, you know, so what do we do now? I said, we go ahead with those who want to do it. So we did. And by the time the ovens were built and functioning, they all wanted to have that. And then I said, well, now you're going to have to wait till phase 2. And as you rightly mentioned, finding funding for this kind of thing is sometimes so difficult, because it's not sexy. Let me put it that way. You know, trees don't seem so excitable as the cuddly, you know, animals that you want to save. And in the same way, this doesn't have that same appeal, because perhaps, and I may be wrong to say so, but it almost seems as though when you have these kinds of small projects that serve communities, it doesn't give the kind of ego boost that a big sponsorship project would, perhaps. And maybe that's why some of these things don't get some of the attention, but it has made a difference in their lives. And it's possible to replicate it, because that was the idea, to make sure it was something that could be replicated within, you know, any market can have this. And you can either have it there where it's fixed, or you can have it in such a way that when the person is moving, they can move away with it. Brilliant technology. And it was really great to work with a team to make it happen. So
that's really excellent. And it's for me, what's really great about that is the sort of relationship between kind of big idea thinking and kind of based in technology and the kind of expert knowledge, but then also combining that with the local knowledge on the ground, making a difference right now. And as you said, you know, get that right and the rest will sell itself. And it's really about making that connection to climate change really real. And I completely agree with you about the kind of, you know, the large scale thinking. Sometimes the sort of large scale ideas about carbon footprint don't necessarily translate to somebody on the ground facing these conditions right now.
Just to add, I think those kinds of large scale ideas, you need to have patience with them, and they need to evolve over time. And I think it's really amazing how you've been able to drive behavioral attitudes and attitudes in general to improving the carbon footprint of the CO2 markets through, something that's tangible and can be monetized, which is always a bonus for.
Yes, exactly. No, and perhaps I'd like to bring in Kweku back into the conversation if you're with us, Kweku.
Yes, I'm here,
okay.
Loud and clear.
Thank you so much for coming back and joining us.
Thank you too. And sorry for earlier.
No, it's
I had a little internet situation. So
no, thank you for joining us again. I guess my question is really off the back of what Dr. Zanet has just described about the conditions of OSU market and working with a kind of a team of experts and then people on the ground and the kind of end user as well. And we started to have a bit of a discussion with you earlier about data and how we use data to sort of work towards solutions for these issues, as well as also how we can start to use, Julia earlier mentioned mapping and mapping strategies, and we know that a lot of your research is focused within those areas of data and mapping and technology. And we're just, I guess my question to you is how we start to, what that work and research can contribute to the issues of flooding and water management in different areas, but primarily for you, I guess, in Ghana. And then also how we sort of work with these systems and technologies in the way there is not kind of on just the kind of grand vision scale, but one that really brings people into understanding those technologies and working with them as well.
Okay. Yeah. Once again, thank you for the opportunity. I think earlier what I was trying to describe was these, just from where Dr. Zaneto left off. These local people have built some kind of knowledge over a period, you know, and most of the time, from my data and research, it looks like there has been a one-sided situation in terms of where we actually extract data from. Most of the time, the people that we engage or the source of data inquiry, first of all, is much of a challenge. Whenever there's a flood situation in Ghana, particularly in Accra, most of the people that we get information from, or the news or the media go to take information from, are the people from NADMO or the district assembly or the local government and what have you. It's very difficult for them to go down to the grassroots, to the local people who are actually the ones directly involved in this situation. And most of the time, it appears as if these people, because they are local people, it's assumed that they don't have much of a contribution to give towards the discussion. And so they are sidelined, and the local authority decide to plan for them, or in other words, decide to actually design the future for them. In this case, it becomes difficult for them to adjust because of two reasons. The first reason is those who are living in the condition are not those who are planning towards the condition. And number two, those who are actually planning for the conditions are also those who are not in the condition. And so it becomes much of a disconnect between these two parties. One of my engagement with the local respondents, I remember, she was of the view that their buildings are designed such a way that whenever there is floods occurring in the community, they have these sandbags that they have, they lay it at the entrance of their buildings. And to them, they've been practicing this for years. Now, what these sandbags do is that it's able to absorb any extra water that comes, so it's not able to enter their rooms. According to them, they've been trying to engage the local partners or the local government so that they can give them more sandbags, or they can also help them to redesign their buildings such that they can actually have behind their buildings, they can have some form of a trench ditch, so that when the water gets into their buildings, it can actually drain down the trench into the gutters or the any gutter around or something. But according to the local partners or the local government, they were also of the view that they have told these people not to live within these areas because they are flood-prone areas, and so they don't see why these people should live there. And so the main question I kept asking myself was, what's the future for these people? Because at the end of the day, this is where they've been living from childhood. This is where they have habited years. And so at the end of the day, they find it difficult to be relocated to other places. And so they rather find the local government as a threat to their very existence. Whilst the local government also find them as some form of, they also find them as people who are not willing to obey the law, or people who are not willing to adjust to the conditions or what have you. But along all this, I think what comes to play that I'm very much concerned with is the interplay of research, observation, and technology. This is a very crucial connection that we need to appreciate to build a better design for the future. Now, in terms of research and the data we collect should be collected across stakeholders, and that it shouldn't be one-sided. There has been a couple of articles, a couple of research that normally we tackle from the top. So we interview the big guys in the situation. We interview the NADMO, we interview the local government, we interview the experts, and so they come up with their own conclusions towards the matter. But then we need to narrow down that research to the various stakeholders who are also directly involved. Most of the time, we interview them basically because we want to understand the conditions they are in, but we don't also add their suggestions towards what needs to also be considered in the planning and mitigation of this situation. And so I believe research should be more practical. Research should be more designed towards people who are also directly involved with a lot of observation, because this is where it becomes easier for us to give out solutions that will practically affect the lives of these people that we are planning for. Then the issue of technology. I believe, like Dr. Zaneto was mentioning, I think in our part of the country, sometimes technology is overdefined. And so whenever we describe technology, we are looking at some state-of-the-art buildings for these people. And I can imagine here in this country, sometimes I hear that a couple of years ago, people, I think the government wanted to design a building for the poor people. They call it the affordable building or something like that. And unfortunately, what happened was something, or buildings we thought were affordable couldn't actually meet the income of these people that were the center of this development. And so I remember the news media were like, is affordable really affordable? And so in my view, if we want to design something, and then we need to consider the technology and what have you, we always need to understand what those we are planning for are used to, number one, and number two, what we can also design so that it wouldn't affect their social fabric and at the same time wouldn't affect the environment. One of the conclusions I came up with during my research was the introduction of rain harvesting. One of the observation that I made during my study was that yes, of course, some of the buildings were along the river banks, or the streams. And so whenever it floods, it overflows into their buildings. But then other were a bit far, but they still also experience floods. And so the question I kept asking myself was, is moving them away from that place the only solution? But one of the experts were like, they need to also redesign their building such that it can collect water. So the first question was, how much will it cost to design their buildings to collect water? And he was like, well, it doesn't really cost much. And then tell them to do that, because at the end of the day, you need to help them. And so some of them started on their roof having this. They just had to sort of coil the roof such that whenever there is an outpour, it can collect the water into a barrel downstream, and they use this water for other activities. And so one thing that struck me was, I think these local people that we plan for, or that are directly involved in this situation, also have a mind of their own. And most of the time, it's important to have a participatory kind of planning and research, such that you research with them and not necessarily for them. So in effect, as we practice research, I believe it should be participatory. I believe technology should consider a way of embracing traditional and then the local way of doing things as well. And thirdly, we should also look at a very pragmatic approach in resolving flood issues and then or situation in the country. To conclude, I believe the situation of mapping is also very, very, very crucial. In one of my articles, I actually had the opportunity to present it in the university, and I was telling them that one of the things that we don't appreciate much in this country is mapping. And sometimes even people who are elite are not able to really navigate their way around when it comes to mapping and what have you. And I feel that the campaign for mapping and spatial planning hasn't also gone down to the very core of this country. And so it's very, very important that we take spatial planning serious and then mapping development serious in order to inform us, particularly if we are to plan, if we are to make development, we need to know the spatial dimension or the physical dimension that it comes with, so that it wouldn't be that we are planning for the educational situation of the country, and for that matter, we are looking at only the social side. We are looking at improving the education of the people. We also need to look at, if we are to educate the people of the country, what are the physical combinations that needs to be factored in? Where do we get land? What are the current description of the terrain? What is the way to actually combine land uses such that there's no encroachment here, there's no haphazard development here, and what have you. We need to embrace planning, we need to embrace mapping, we need to embrace spatial development also in our design thinking. And I think that could also go a long way to help. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I think that's a really nice way to, I think we've managed to kind of come back to a kind of nice conclusion that picks up all the things that we've been discussing this evening. And it's been a really wide-ranging conversation that is really, for Lois and I, has really focused on both the kind of infrastructural sort of big idea thinking, as well as the local sort of more on the ground with people that are invested in the condition, leading that conversation. And then the other side of it as well, has been really nice to sort of also talk about the kind of built infrastructure versus the natural infrastructure that we have, and how to work with those and actually start to begin to center the natural infrastructure we have as the starting points to these conversations. And we've slightly gone over time, but if there are any burning questions in the audience, please do put them in the chat on the YouTube live. But perhaps before we close out, maybe I can ask each panel member, starting with Becky, if that's okay, to perhaps summarize with some critical questions for the Future by Design team as they move into the kind of design phase of the project, or any thoughts or observations or lessons that can be taken forward into the build project.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, it's just fascinating to hear how using planting can be incorporated into the design structure. I think it's something that is very important going forward. And this project is just a great way to experiment and showcase that, and to have young designers doing it as well. It's just wonderful. So I'm just looking forward to it. There's no critical questions and such. It's just yeah, it's going to be fantastic to see how it progresses. And yeah, thank you again for this evening. It's been wonderful listening to you all.
And then thank you very much, Rebecca. And perhaps I can ask Julia next.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, similarly from Becca, thank you everyone. Firstly, I really enjoyed the chat today. So thanks for having me. Yeah, I think for me, the thing that I'm finding really interesting is about these sort of cultural step changes, how you do that, and then how that links with education, particularly working with young people and taking that really seriously.
Great, thank you. And perhaps if I come to you next, Dr. Zanifer, and then finally to Kweku.
Thank you. I've actually got a few notes that I made. Thank you very much. This has been really, really amazing. And I hope we can keep doing this. Certainly the take home is, if you have a good project and you don't get the buy-in of the local people, forget it. It's not going to work. And that's a lesson I learned. And that was what led the project. But I'm looking forward to a different approach to helping with the flooding. I remember we were trying to figure out where in the constituency we could have the buyer's wells, right? I think that's the correct pronunciation. And there is a gentleman who actually has a biofilter that actually deals with, because we have a problem with our gray water because it's not really gray. Everything is in the drains. And what he does is these biofilters actually use aerobic respiration to break down the organic matter in it. So it doesn't have a smell. And what happens is the liquid that comes off it is used to actually water the plants. And we have a couple of places in Accra, in Jobulu, and I think Perez Chapel has an example of that, where they use these biofilters in their public toilets, and the water is it goes through this biofilter, and that's what they use to water their gardens. Beautiful gardens. So it shows what's possible. And the water that runs in our gutters, that funky smell that it's got, is because of what's in it. And these biofilters can actually filter it properly so that that water can be used to actually water the plants that we're going to be using to actually prevent the flooding. So there is an upside to that. And so I'd be really excited to perhaps facilitate a meeting with a gentleman who's come up with this technology and see how we can use it to do a few more of these projects around the city as we try and merge the environment and technology to solve some of these problems.
Great, that's incredible. And I think especially with really learning the water has a cyclical nature, and really remembering that kind of cyclical journey of water. So thank you. Perhaps I come back to you, Kweku, for any closing questions or observations as the Future by Design team progress onto the kind of design stages of the project.
Yeah, thank you. I think to conclude, I would also recommend that as we journey towards this, through this, I believe that the technology of drones and mapping also is quite crucial. Currently, there's this project that we are trying to work on to have a historical data of flood areas in Kumasi and Accra. The challenge is that we are not able to really understand where exactly this flood situation is paramount, or better, for lack of better words, where it is severe, because our data, unfortunately, is not so reliable. We are working towards finding a way to make our data more solid in terms of our rainfall data, historical flood data, and aerial photographs that we can use to interplay and even appreciate areas that have had historical flood situations and can help us inform stakeholders when it comes to building development. Where is it suitable to develop? Where is it not suitable to develop? And so I think it's still a journey that we are working towards, and we hope to build a very strong data system that can be able to help mitigate the situation effectively.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we'll close there with three minutes past 8, which is not too bad. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists and to Nana. I think this has just been an incredibly fruitful conversation and lots of food for thought for me, and hopefully for the Future by Design team going forward. As ever, I think having conversations across disciplines just highlights the need to have them. It's kind of like, the only way to tackle global environmental issues. We're going to be hosting, Nana and I, a follow-up event, similar format, but that's going to more closely coincide with the build element that May and Tom are orchestrating. And this will explore not only the issue of flooding, but coping strategies, both kind of micro and macro. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled on the Cove Park website and Instagram channels for more information on that, and we will see you in a couple of months' time. Thank you to everyone that's joined us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you
very
so
much,
everybody. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.